In the face of the escalation of Israeli attacks on Palestinians in occupied East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, which have caused at least 48 deaths, we now welcome Shabbir Lakha, activist and officer of the Stop the War Coalition in the United Kingdom. Shabbir, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Shabbir, Israel's war crimes against the Palestinian people are nothing new. We're talking about the ongoing ethnic cleansing in Israeli-occupied Jerusalem, the bombardments of the civilian population in Gaza, which is the world's largest open-air prison. But what can you tell us about the context surrounding the latest escalation of the Israeli regime's attacks?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, this is nothing new. Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories, including East Jerusalem, and the apartheid system which they have in place, which Palestinians have to live under, has been going on for a long time. I think this latest escalation has come from a round of evictions that are due to take place. Some have already taken place in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem, where Palestinians have been kicked out of their homes so that settlers can take over. And Palestinians are fed up and they rightly protested against this action by the Israeli courts. They were met with violence by the Israeli military for protesting. And we saw last Friday that they raided the Al-Aqsa Mosque, during Ramadan, and injured up to 600 worshippers and civilians. And that's where this stems from. And what we're seeing is that Israel is ramping up its aggression against the Palestinians. It is killing and maiming Palestinians left, right, and center. And Palestinians aren't just sitting by and letting it happen. They are resisting and they are protesting back.
Shabbir, the International Criminal Court announced earlier this year that it was launching an investigation into the Israeli war crimes against Palestinians, and the Palestinian authorities have called on the court to speed up this process, given the current escalation of attacks. How important is this move, and what impact could a ruling from the court actually have in terms of stopping the Zionist agenda?
I think a ruling from the ICC could have an impact in delegitimizing Israel and what it's doing. I think it could have the impact of boosting Palestinian solidarity and forcing governments to take some action. But I think it will be very limited. I think the scope of the ICC's inquiry will be limited because Israel doesn't recognize the ICC, and so how much they can investigate is limited. And quite frankly, the fact is that Israel has been violating international law since 1947, and nothing has been done about it. We don't need the ICC to tell us that Israel has repeatedly violated the Geneva Conventions. There is ample evidence of, the killing of innocent Palestinian civilians, war crimes, the use of banned weapons, including white phosphorus and depleted uranium. And yet nothing has happened. Israel has been able to do this with impunity, and how much an ICC ruling would add to force Israel to be held to account is hard to see.
Shabbir, there were recently postponed elections. Elections were postponed, which would have been the first elections in Palestine for 15 years. The cause was supposed to be because of Israel not allowing Palestinians to exercise their right to vote in East Jerusalem. It's caused some more division within the Palestinian authorities and the different factions there. Do you think the latest escalation of attacks is linked to this whole situation around the elections and the possibility of Palestinians moving forwards?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the reason why the elections were postponed is related to Palestinians in Jerusalem not being able to vote. But I think more than that, Mahmoud Abbas was probably aware that his position was threatened, and I think Palestinians are, really disillusioned with the Palestinian leadership. I don't know how linked it would be to the current crisis, other than to say that I think Palestinians are not waiting around for the leadership anymore. I think we saw the protests in Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem, which Palestinians took part in without waiting for some kind of official leadership to call them. And I think the Palestinians in Gaza similarly are fed up of this maintaining of the status quo. Like you said, this would be the first time that there are elections in Palestine in a long time. And I think even if these elections did happen, or when they do happen, the scope of what the Palestinian government can do is quite limited because they are an interim government, and Israel still has the superior authority. So I think Palestinians are taking things into their own hands, and they're making their voices heard on the streets.
Shabbir, the international community continues to denounce the illegal occupation of Palestinian land by Israel, calling for efforts towards peace, the establishment of the Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. However, as you say, Israel continues to enjoy the support of Western governments, military aid, etc., not to mention the biased Western media coverage that makes Israel out to be the victim and its attacks to be a response to those of the Palestinian resistance movement. As many people across the world today are expressing their solidarity with Palestine and looking on and likely feeling despair at yet another escalation, what can we concretely do to campaign for the rights of the Palestinian people and an end to Israel's crimes?
Yeah, well, I think what you've said is very important, and I think it points to the role of Western countries in allowing Israel to carry out the actions that it's carrying out. It points to the relationship that Israel has with Western countries, which is one of imperialism, is one of maintaining Western dominance in the Middle East, and that's why Britain and the US are willing to let Israel, get away with the things that it is, and to continue funding it, and to continue providing it with military and diplomatic cover. And I think that's, in terms of what we can do concretely, I think that has to be at the center of our understanding of what's going on in Palestine. And we have to recognize the role of our governments in doing this, and we have to target our governments in our opposition. So in the United Kingdom, there are dozens of protests that will be taking place over the weekend. And our message is clear, is that Boris Johnson's government and Britain's historic role in supporting Israel is not in our name, and we will not stand by for it. And we will be out on the streets, and we will pressure our government to end this support for Israel. And I think that's the most concrete thing we can do to both reject what our government is doing and to show our solidarity with the people of Palestine, that they're not alone in this fight.
Shabbir Lakha, activist and officer of the Stop the War Coalition in the United Kingdom. Thank you so much for joining us, for shedding more light on the Palestinian struggle against the apartheid state of Israel and what we can do to try and fight against it. Thank you.
Thank you.